Okay, so welcome everybody to the Wu-Ru Library. Over the years, we've had a kind of lecture series at the library. We try to obtain distinguished lecturers to come and give formal lectures here. And so this afternoon, we're very delighted and privileged to have Robert Wright come to give a lecture. I first came across the name of Robert Wright in the year 2001. I was living in Singapore, and I would go periodically to the local library in Singapore, and browsing the bookshelves, I came across an interesting title called No Zero. And so I checked the book out and read it, and I was quite impressed by it. Years later, after I came back to the United States, and when I was looking on the internet, I came across something called the Meaning of Life TV, which was being conducted by somebody named Robert Wright. And I was wondering, could that be the same person who authored that book that I read in Singapore? And I did a little investigation, and I found that it was indeed that same person. I also learned that he had written several other books, at least over the years. One is called The Evolution of God, and another is called The Moral Animal, which was regarded by the New York Times as one of the 10 best nonfiction books of that year. But the flap of this didn't mention what year it was published, and so. Anyway, so Robert Wright was conducting this program called The Meaning of Life TV, in which he conducts interviews with sort of prominent thinkers in the field of religion, philosophy, technology, psychology. And then at a certain point, I got an inquiry through email from a Robert Wright asking if he could interview me for that program. And so that way we established some connection. And then when I saw that the book, Why Buddhism is True, when I heard about it in advance and then saw that it had been published, then the idea came to me to invite him to come to our library to give a lecture. And so we're very privileged and delighted that he is with us this afternoon. So please. You could either sit or stand.
What is the tradition? Is there a preferred?
I think because people are in the back, so if it's not uncomfortable.
Okay, if I get tired, I'll
Yeah.
take a nap. Okay, thank you. Can people hear me? Yes. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to everyone here for hosting me. Thanks, Kaidi, for helping to arrange this. And thanks to Bhante Mangala, if I pronounced the name correctly. Is that right? Is that good? For giving me a nice tour of the facilities. And a special thanks to Bhante Bodhi for more than you acknowledged in the course of your introduction. You are responsible for what is good about the book, not responsible for anything that's bad about the book. But I mean, first of all, for those of you who don't know, Bhante Bodhi, also known as Bhikkhu Bodhi, which is the reason I called him Bantu the first time, which is wrong. It's either Bhikkhu Bodhi or Bhante meaning venerable. He's one of the foremost scholars of Buddhism alive today. He has translated vast quantities of Buddhist texts into English. And if you want a good introductory course to Buddhism, I recommend Googling these lectures that he recorded, I don't know when, in the 1970s or the 80s or something?
It's 1981.
1981. Just a wonderful, wonderful introduction to Buddhism at an accessible but really deep level. I've listened to each of them at least twice. And then I learned a lot when I did interview you for Meaning of Life TV. That was very helpful. But more than that, as I was finishing the book and coming across things that I was unsure of and places where I thought I might have things wrong, I got in touch with Bhante Bodhi, and he was extremely generous with his time. We had a couple of Skype conversations. He responded to my emails, and I was like revising footnotes to try to make sure that I was presenting things in a defensible way. And I'm sure the book still has deficiencies, but it has fewer than it would have if he hadn't been so generous with his time, so thank you. Should I stand on the...
Yeah, that's okay.
I feel... Do I seem more important than I did only 30 seconds ago? Well, then I'll stay here. I feel I should start out by saying something a little about the title, perhaps something a little defensive about the title. It rubs some people the wrong way. Is there anyone here, be honest, is there anyone here who found it just a little too much, a little obnoxious, or a little... You? Okay, so you can all leave now. I should talk about that a little. You shouldn't throw around the word true casually. In fact, in Buddhism, there have been long discussions over whether there is such thing as ultimate truth, with some people doubting whether it makes sense to talk that way. I have an appendix in the book trying to be clear on exactly what I mean by the word true and so on. I won't get into quite that fine-grained a level right now, but I do think I should tell you what it is that I'm saying is true about Buddhism. What part of Buddhism am I talking about? Well, for starters, I'd say I'm talking about what is sometimes called the naturalistic part of Buddhism, as distinguished sometimes from what you might call the, some people might call it the religious part, other people might call it the supernatural part, although in some cases, what they might call supernatural, some people might call rebirth supernatural, some people might say it's just metaphysical in a particularly kind of exotic way, but not necessarily supernatural. But in any event, those are the parts of Buddhism I don't get into. What I do get into are the parts of Buddhism that you can evaluate from a standpoint of modern psychology and modern philosophy, and that's what I try to do. Some people use the term secular Buddhism to refer to these parts of Buddhism. I'm kind of ambivalent about that term myself, but that's basically what I do deal with in the book. Now, as for to zero in a little more tightly on what it is I'm saying is true about Buddhism, it seems to me that at the core of Buddhism is a pretty radical claim, really. It's the claim that the reason we suffer and the reason we make other people suffer is because we don't see the world clearly. Okay? We have illusions about ourselves, about others, about the nature of reality, and these are the things that lead to our suffering. And these are also the things that lead us to behave toward other people in ways that make them needlessly suffer. Now, when you think about it, this is a pretty amazing claim, because what it suggests is that in principle, we could kill three birds with one stone, so to speak, right? Because if it's true that the thing that makes us happy, the thing that makes us behave badly toward others, is not seeing the world clearly, then in principle, all you have to do is see the world clearly. You'll become a lot happier. You'll become a much better person. So in principle, the claim is that truth and happiness and goodness can align. And that there's even a natural alignment that we just ordinarily fail to realize or fail to approximate. Now, in addition to making this claim, that you can in principle do these three things at once, and that you can in that sense kill three birds with one stone, Buddhism provides the stone, so to speak. In other words, it doesn't just have a diagnosis of the human condition, it has a prescription. It has a path of learning and practice that is aimed at helping you see the world more clearly, become happier, and become better. Part of that path is meditation, and one kind of meditation that I think is very important is mindfulness meditation, and I talk a lot about that in the book. I'm sure some of you do mindfulness meditation. Probably pretty much all of you have heard of it. I'll be saying a little bit more about it in case you're not clear on what it is, but What I want to say now is that I think mindfulness meditation has a reputation for being kind of therapeutic. You hear a lot about it in that context, mindfulness-based stress reduction, dealing with anxiety. And I do think that these are important uses of mindfulness meditation, and certainly in keeping with Buddhist principles. But at the same time, I think mindfulness meditation is deeply connected to really fundamental ideas in Buddhist philosophy, and very radical sounding ideas in Buddhist philosophy. And in the book, I tried to draw out those connections between the practice of mindfulness meditation and these ideas you may have heard about, like not self, this radical sounding idea that in some sense or another the self doesn't exist, or the concept that's often known as emptiness, which I'll talk about a little. I do think that more than is appreciated, getting interested in mindfulness meditation can be the first step toward exploring some of these ideas, not just in an academic way, but in an experiential way. And one of the interesting and distinctive things about Buddhism, I think, is this kind of wedding of experiential and intellectual knowledge. So these principles in Buddhism, you can argue for them just intellectually the way you would in a classroom, but the idea is that also you can experientially apprehend them. And that's a very distinctive thing about the tradition, and one that I do talk about in the book. Now, I'm obviously not the first person to say that Buddhism is valid, right? I mean, lots of people have said that, notably Buddhists. You might wonder, like, what's so special about me? What do I have? Obviously, if I'm going to title a book, Why Buddhism is True, it suggests I think I have something new to say about it, and you might ask what entitles me to make that claim. Well, the good news is that I don't claim to have had any special meditative revelation or anything. I didn't meditate for months and months and come back and see something no one's ever seen and have this special illumination that I'm going to try to articulate. What my claim is that there's just a kind of illumination of the logic behind Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist psychology that has only become available really within the past several decades, thanks to advances in psychology and in particular evolutionary psychology, which is one thing, of course, that I'm going to talk about today. And what I do in the book is argue that what we know, what we've learned in recent decades, adds a lot of credence to even these radical sounding claims that come from Buddhism. Now, evolutionary psychology is basically just the study of how natural selection shaped the human mind. Natural selection, of course, is just the idea that those traits over evolutionary time, those traits in any species, including ours, those traits that are best at getting genes into the next generation, that are most conducive to genetic proliferation, are, if they are genetically based traits that will survive in the lineage and flourish. So if a gene gives rise to a trait that is conducive to genetic proliferation, then that gene will do well. It's really a tautology. It almost can't help but happen. I mean, so some obvious examples are, in terms of the human mind, I mean, there are also obvious, there are obvious examples that are, like if we didn't have legs, we couldn't walk and run and go get things to eat and stuff, obviously. But as far as the mind goes, as far as evolutionary psychology goes, some obvious feelings that make sense are like, hunger and lust. I mean, they get you to eat food, and that helps you stay alive long enough to get your genes spread. And of course, lust plays a more direct role in getting genes into the next generation. So it's pretty clear why those things would become part of a lineage. Evolutionary psychology is also, it's gotten, and this is really what distinguishes it, or one thing that does from maybe earlier ideas. It's come up with plausible explanations for why less obvious parts of the human mind are with us, things like altruism and love, a sense of obligation, gratitude, a lot of these things that aren't so obviously animal in their nature. Now, I wrote a book about evolutionary psychology that came out in 1994 called The Moral Animal. And after the experience of researching it and writing it, I was left in some ways unsettled because there were a couple of things that I just really took on board in the course of researching the book and writing it. One was that we just are not designed to be happy in an enduring way by natural selection. And when I say designed, I should put that in quotes because natural selection is not a conscious designer, but still, it creates animals that look as if they were designed, engineered to do certain things that are conducive to reproduction. And it's pretty clear that we were not built to be enduringly happy. In fact, we were built for happiness to have this tendency to evaporate. I'm sure you're all familiar with the problem, right? I mean, donut looks good, you eat the donut, the thrill lasts for a while, then it fades, you want more. You're looking forward to some promotion and it makes you feel good for a while and then you want more. Whatever, gratification tends to evaporate. And when you think about it, it makes total sense that natural selection would design organisms whose gratification evaporates, right? Because, if you imagine an animal that just eats one meal and then just sits there contented, just going, whoa, that was good, for like days on end, well, that animal will starve to death, right? You need the animal, you need for the hunger, the restlessness to return. And if we were built to, after sex, just bask in the afterglow for like months and not get up and do things like, the various things that keep us alive and reproducing, that too would not be a good trait. So the quest for gratification leads us to do the things that natural selection, quote, wants us to do. And those include a lot of things beyond eating and having sex. They include things like earning the esteem of other people, keeping our offspring safe and tending to other relatives and so on. There's a lot of these things that natural selection, quote, wants us to do, but it tends to accomplish that by making us do them as a way of generating happiness that then evaporates, or generating satisfaction that then evaporates. Now, you may already be noticing a kind of resonance with Buddhism because the Buddha is famous for emphasizing suffering. He is sometimes said to have said that life is suffering. I'm not sure he actually ever said that. He didn't ever say that, okay? So it's not that depressing. He did say that suffering is a recurring feature of life. And what I've just said helps explain why it is a recurring feature of life, right? There's just kind of unsatisfactoriness. Recurring unsatisfactoriness is built into us. And interestingly, the word that is translated as suffering, dukkha, is said by scholars who have studied these things in ways that I'm not capable of, but is said to have a strong connotation of unsatisfactoriness. Some people even translate it as unsatisfactoriness. But in any event, if you think of suffering that way, as suffering that really integrally involves recurring dissatisfaction, unease, this recurring desire for things to be different than the way they are, that just makes total sense in terms of natural selection. Now, so it's clear we're not designed to be happy. A certain amount of suffering tends to come naturally to us. The other thing I realized is that we're not designed to see the world clearly, okay? Because again, natural selection, its bottom line is very simple. Any trait that will help genes get into the next generation is a trait that natural selection will, in principle, favor if it's a genetically based trait. If you can get more genes into the next generation by having some kind of delusion, by not seeing things clearly, then natural selection will in principle favor that delusion. Okay, there's no doubt about that among evolutionary biologists. That is the case. And further, I think we can point to some ways in which we are designed by natural selection to see things unclearly. In fact, in a certain sense, this this dynamic by which we keep pursuing gratification and it keeps evaporating, you could say that that is an example of not seeing things clearly. Certainly in Buddhism, it is viewed that way. It's viewed as a failure to really reckon with the reality of impermanence and to cling to things and to pursue things as if they could last forever, when in fact they're not going to last forever. You might say, well, that's not really an illusion, it's not quite a misperception, it's an asymmetry of perception. Because okay, when you're like looking at that donut, it's true that you're thinking about how good it'll taste. You're not thinking about how 5 minutes later you'll have a restless hunger for more, but that's just an asymmetrical perception or a disproportionate emphasis on one thing. It's not out and out self-deception. You could argue it either way, but certainly there are clear-cut, just simple cases, pedestrian cases, where we don't by nature see the world clearly, and natural selection seems to be the reason. I mean, one example is there are these experiments that if you ask people to estimate a slope, like you're looking at a hill and you estimate the slope, if they're tired, if they're fatigued, if you get them fatigued, they will estimate the slope as being more extreme, okay? Now you can see why that would work from natural selection's point of view. It's one way to get people who are really tired and their resources are really depleted to not take on a task that they're not capable of, right? So it just fills you with this illusion that it's a super steep hill. It could have, natural selection could have worked the other way. It could have just given you a clear assessment of what the exact slope is, but put this circuit in your head where you go, but I shouldn't try that because I'm tired, and so on. But that's not the way it did it. It actually natural selection built in a little illusion there about the actual slope of the hill. Similarly, when big objects are approaching us, we tend to overestimate the speed at which they're approaching. And, that makes sense too, right? Because it's better to get out of the way too soon than too late if you're being pursued by some wild animal or whatever. So you can see why. I mean, that's not a profound misperception, but it illustrates the point that natural selection is willing to instill in us a tendency toward misperception if that is conducive to keeping us alive so that we can, get genes into the next generation. Now, the principle that's at work in that case where you're overestimating the speed of an approaching object, you could say that is just kind of a better safe than sorry principle, right? It's a kind of like what you might call a false positive, right? You're overly sensitive to the possibility that something bad will happen, and that keeps you taking the preventive measures that keep that bad thing from happening, right? You're exaggerating the chances of something bad happening, in this case, this large object catching up with you. And that exaggeration makes you take these precautionary measures. So better safe than sorry, we are prone to these false positives, but they keep us alive. But note, by the way, that this example does involve not just seeing things unclearly, but it involves a little suffering, right? Because if you pay attention, when this thing is approaching you and you're overestimating its speed, you feel like a little bit of anxiety, right? But again, natural selection doesn't care. I mean, if anxiety will get us to do things that natural selection wants us to do, then anxiety there will be, and anxiety there is, as I'm sure you're all aware. Another example would be. My daughter's actually out west, and she just the other day, she's like doing a lot of walking, and she was walking along, she heard this rattle and looked in front of her, and it was a coiled rattlesnake. And this is something she will not soon forget as she continues to walk across the Nevada desert, or wherever she is. And when you imagine like what her state of mind is going to be like now, or for that matter, just what your state of mind would be like if you were just taking a hike and you had heard that there were rattlesnakes, right? If you hear a rustling in the brush, you will probably think for a second, if you've been sufficiently scared, if they've said, somebody was bit just last month here, and you hear that rustling, you're probably going to think for a second that it's a rattlesnake. If a lizard darts out, you may well for a second actually see a rattlesnake, right? So again, it's just better safe than sorry. Natural selection is willing for us to be wrong about things and willing for us to suffer in the process. So these aren't deep examples where misperception is aligned with suffering, but they illustrate the fact that this kind of thing can result from natural selection being your creator. So when I finished writing that book, I was, in some ways uncomfortable because I was only more aware of kind of our imperfections of perception and the various problems with being human. And I should say that evolutionary psychology also emphasizes how our moral judgment is often warped by our genes. Okay, we're more inclined to think that we're in the right and the other person is in the wrong than is plausible, and so on. And so, for a lot of reasons, I think I was really not any happier with being human by the time I finished this book than I had been before, because I understood at least as deeply as ever how problematic the human condition was, but I didn't have anything to do about it. Evolutionary psychology describes the problem but doesn't offer a prescription. Well, Buddhism both describes the problem and offers a prescription. And as it happens, I eventually wound up trying a one-week meditation retreat. I had tried to meditate. I had never really gotten a lot out of it. And so I thought, well, try boot camp, do like a one-week silent meditation retreat. This was 2003. I went to the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. And how many of you have been on retreats, by the way? So a lot of veterans. So as you know, or as you may have experienced, the first couple of days were not fun. It was mostly consisted of like looking around and imagining that everyone else was doing wonderfully and knowing that I wasn't. I couldn't focus on my breath, I could whatever. But by the end of the week, I felt completely transformed. I mean, my state of consciousness was just in a completely different place than it had ever been. I was much more appreciative of beauty. I mean, by the end of the retreat, I was like stopping and gazing at the bark of trees and things, and believe me, I'm not the kind of person that you would normally find doing that. I was much less judgmental of other people. I remember at the beginning of the retreat, you're looking around, there's about 80, 90 people, and you're kind of sizing them up. And of course, you have no basis, no actual evidence about any of them, so you just use, being human, you just use the most superficial evidence that is there. And I remember seeing a guy who had a shirt on that said Juilliard, the elite music school, Juilliard. And I remember kind of thinking, oh, Juilliard, well, aren't we special, and that's just the way I am. But by the end of the retreat, I was not that way at all. And of course, the other thing, at the end of the retreat, when the silence was broken, as it happens, the guy with the Juilliard t-shirt got up and asked a question, and he was the most timid, insecure soul you can imagine. So I had, of course, completely misgauged his character on the basis of his t-shirt. So anyway, I remember I called my wife at the end of the retreat, and she says that before I had said anything, just by the tone of my voice, she liked the new Bob. It was like, now this is a guy I would like to be married to. And I'm not sure she had ever really had exactly that feeling before, but she did for this moment. Now, it's not, as you know, if you've been on retreats and they work for you, it's not easy to hang on to exactly that state of mind at the end. You stick with the practice, hope to hold on to some of it. But still, one thing it illustrated to me is just how far from optimal ordinary human consciousness is. It is so bad. It's just, it's like you are spending so much time in needlessly self-involved rumination and judgment of other people and worries and so on, and you're missing a lot of wonderful things about the world in the process. And so this really had an impact on me. And in addition, I had some particular experiences during the retreat that got my attention. One of them this was my kind of first big breakthrough in meditating. This was several days into the retreat, and I had had a little too much coffee in the morning, and so I was sitting there meditating, and because of the overcaffeination, I had this kind of tooth grinding thing, like a tension in my jaw, and I was like kind of too amped up. And I was thinking, oh, I'm trying to meditate, and I've got this thing in my jaw. And then I thought, well, okay, it is mindfulness meditation. And for those of you who don't know what mindfulness meditation is, I mean, certainly one thing it involves is just kind of careful observation of things going on in your realm of experience. To do that, you have to first attain a certain amount of kind of equilibrium of mind, and that's why mindfulness meditation starts off with focusing on something like maybe the breath, just as a way to stabilize the mind. But the idea is that you get to a point where you can pay attention to things with unusual kind of closeness, kind of. So I thought, well, I'm supposed to be doing mindfulness meditation. I'll try to just observe this unpleasant feeling in my jaw. And after a while, like just kind of all of a sudden, I felt like, okay, well, there is that tension in my jaw, but it's in my jaw, and I'm not in my jaw. So it's really not a problem. And I was still observing it. The feeling was still there, but it was no longer a problem. I felt as if I was not attached to it in some sense. And I want to be careful about that language, because detachment is in some ways a misleading way to put it, because it results from actually experiencing the feeling in an unusually full way. But it is the case. You know, it's funny. I was having this experience this morning. I had a couple hours drive here, and I was like, this morning I was like, am I going to be late? And you know, and I thought, well, if you're going to give a talk on mindfulness, you should be mindful about these anxiety feelings. And I just realized, and so I paid attention to them, and I realized that ordinarily we don't really feel our feelings when they are at their most coercive, when they're like doing that thing that they were doing to me and making me feel really uncomfortable. I mean, in a sense, I felt the discomfort, but I wasn't really the deeper anxiety feeling. I just was not being attentive to. So there is this irony that in mindfulness meditation, you more fully experience the feeling, but by doing that, you get some critical distance from it. And that sounds ironic, but it seems to be the case. You know, I had more, you know, more, in a way, more after the retreat, in a way, more dramatic examples of that same thing. I was going to give a talk the next day somewhere, and it was kind of a big thing, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and I did this thing that I sometimes do where I start thinking, well, wait, what if you can't get to sleep? You know? And in fact, I want to take a second to hone in on this fear of public speaking thing, because it's a perfect example, actually, of how evolutionary psychology can illuminate problems and how living in the environment we live in, which is not really a natural environment, is particularly problematic. Okay, so evolutionary psychologists would say that anxiety is natural. In other words, if you go back 20,000 years when everybody was hunter-gatherers, there would be anxiety. They would if they realized that their toddler had wandered off and they hadn't seen them in 5 minutes, they would be filled with anxiety, like what's wrong with the kid, and that would motivate them, or, you know, where is my child? That would motivate them to run and look for the child. And similarly, you know, there was anxiety about how you were perceived by other people, because apparently maintaining the esteem of people, you know, having some social stature was correlated with reproductive success. So that seems to be built into us, an anxiety about what people think about us. However, you take these things, parental anxiety, social anxiety, and you move them into a modern environment, and they start misfiring and making things even worse. So again, it is natural to feel anxious about a toddler. But what's not natural, what you won't find hunter-gatherers doing, is leaving their toddler at a daycare center on the first day of like the semester where they don't know anyone. To leave your child in the hands of people you don't know, that's not natural. So the anxiety gets even worse, even though it's not particularly productive. Same thing with public speaking. In hunter-gatherer societies, you don't see people talking to hundreds of people they've never met. It just, that's not a natural thing. So the anxiety gets amped up, and there are people that have really, I mean, it's uncomfortable for many of us to contemplate future public speaking, but some people have very serious pathologies associated with it. So anyway, this was the night before, like a big talk, and I was like, oh no, what if I can't get to sleep? And the more you think about that, of course, the more impossible it is to get to sleep. I thought, well, okay, I'll sit up and meditate. I sat up in bed, and I observed the anxiety, paid attention to where it was in my body, and suddenly I got to a point where it was like observing a piece of abstract sculpture in a museum. You know, it was like I had a sense of where exactly it was located, but I was completely indifferent to it. I didn't have anything against it. I didn't like it. I was just observing it, and then it kind of dissipates. So these things got my attention. And they led me to more thoroughly investigate Buddhism. I went on more retreats. I interviewed people like Bhikkhu Bodhi, and read stuff, and I became convinced that Buddhism's diagnosis of the human predicament is really very much like evolutionary psychology's, and that in addition, Buddhism has some things that actually help you do something about it. Now, I don't want to talk a whole lot longer because I want to leave time for questions. But I did say early on that that mindfulness meditation isn't merely therapeutic. It really is connected to some of these deep ideas in Buddhism. So I at least want to give you a flavor for what I mean by that. And then those of you who are interested can follow up in question and answer or whatever, but I at least want to give you a sense of that. And first of all, actually, this idea of viewing the anxiety as not part of yourself, that is related to this idea of not self. And in fact, if you go to the kind of fundamental text on this, the Buddha's so-called first discourse of the not self, the way he goes through things is he goes through the various parts of human experience, you know, feeling and various kind of mental objects and so on, and says, you know, do you really have control of this? And is it not the case that it sometimes leads to affliction? You know, it leads to unhappiness, and so like, are you sure you want to consider this part of yourself? I mean, he doesn't put it quite like that. He's a little more insistent that it's not right to view it as part of yourself. It's more than just a suggestion, but it is one way to get at the idea of not self. Now, this is not a full-fledged explanation of what the concept means by any means, but the way the Buddha chose to lay it out is to look at individual parts of human experience and emphasize that you don't have to view these as part of yourself, as part of the self. You can view them all as not self. And what happens when you do view all of them as not self? Well, that's when you start, in principle, having some profound experiences and really apprehending this idea of not self in a deeply experiential way. Now, I don't claim to have quite done that. I've been on a number of retreats and have had some, you know, reasonably deep experiences, I think, but I'm not one of these adept meditators by any means who accesses these kinds of experiences on any kind of regular basis, or even who, in some cases, kind of goes around everyday life in this kind of, you know, not self state of mind, as some of them report doing. But I will say that what many of them report, if you ask, how did they get to these great depths, these great meditative depths, and really apprehend not self in a kind of a full-fledged way, a lot of them will say it started out like this. It started out like looking at something like anxiety and developing a capacity to not consider it part of you. Various feelings, and then thoughts, you know, experiencing these things again on the one hand, a very full-bodied way, but at the same time in a way that gives you a certain critical distance from them, so that you are no longer their slave. You have, in a certain sense, a more objective vantage point. So just two quick of my kind of meditative experiences, one that's relevant to not self, and then one that's relevant to this concept of emptiness, just to flesh out a little more what I see as the connections between mindfulness, meditation, and these ideas. So one of them, again, this is in the domain of kind of not self. I was meditating. It's probably day 5 or day 6 of a retreat, and I felt a tingling in my foot, and I heard a bird sing, and it just suddenly felt like the tingling in my foot was no more a part of me than the bird, and the bird was no less a part of me than the tingling in my foot, okay? The bounds of myself, for at least a little while, the bounds of myself had kind of dissolved. And this is reported by people who know what they're talking about much more than I do, but as being a part of a kind of a not self experience. There's just a sense of continuity with the world. The terminology gets tricky here, how exactly you describe it. There are a lot of Buddhists who would say you shouldn't call it oneness because of some philosophical issues I could get into. Well, I can tell you, I mean, the idea is if the self doesn't exist, then it doesn't make sense to say that the self is one with the world. It's more like the self is kind of dissolving and there's a continuity of that sort. But in any event, you can imagine how not self could have moral, ethical implications, right? If you don't feel a distinction between you and the rest of the world, if you're not privileging this realm over the rest of the world, well, that could influence the way you behave toward other beings in a pretty obvious and straightforward way. And again, I mean, the path, mindfulness meditation has a lot to do with the path that gets you to places like this. It does, because what I would say about that experience is the reason, a prerequisite, I think, for my experiencing the continuity, a prerequisite for this dissolution of the bounds of self, was the fact that the interior of myself had gotten pretty disaggregated in the way I was experiencing it, okay? So I wasn't particularly identifying with the feelings and the thoughts within this envelope to begin with, and I think that's one thing that made it easier to feel continuity between what's in this envelope and what's beyond. And I can talk more about not self if you have questions about it, but I want to just talk a little bit about this other concept called emptiness. Now, emptiness, that's the standard translation of this term. It's in some ways misleading. It sounds pretty negative because it's like, who wants to see the emptiness of things, right? That doesn't sound pleasant to... I've never heard anybody just joyfully report that they had finally realized that everything is empty. I mean, you might hear Buddhists say it, but I mean, other people would not like the way that sounded. So let me give you, I think I had kind of a flash of it on a meditation retreat, and let me tell you what it was. So I was walking through the woods. This was on my first retreat, and I encountered this weed. It's a plantain weed. And I had spent, a non-trivial amount of time trying to kill this very kind of weed because it's exactly the kind of weed that had infested both lawns I had owned. I'm happy to say I had usually not resorted to chemicals. I had actually tried to, uproot the thing. But I really had spent time doing war with this thing. And I looked at it, and it just looked beautiful. And it looked exactly as beautiful as the other non-weed plants that were in the forest right next to it. It was just part of a beautiful expanse of nature. And I thought, why have I been trying to kill this thing? I mean, why? Who decided to call these things weeds? Whose idea was that? And, at one point, at one level, I was making a very trivial observation, which is just that, obviously, weed is a human-invented category, right? It doesn't say, weed is not stamped in the DNA. And different cultures have different ideas about what are the weeds, right? One culture's flowers, another culture's weed. So weed is clearly an arbitrary component, or an arbitrary, it's like an imposition or let me say, it's an arbitrary categorization. That much you can explain to someone and they will accept it. But it's different to experience that, or experience its disappearance as I did. When you realize that decategorizing it, taking it out of the weed category, makes you feel in a profoundly different way toward it, then you realize that these categories are deeply embedded in our perceptual apparatus, okay? So what we're doing is we're imposing essences on things perceptually. And in fact, one way to describe the doctrine of emptiness, it's the doctrine that things don't really have essences. We go around imposing essences on things, and but they're not there. Weed is not a true, natural category. We impose these essences on things. It's so subtle we don't realize we're doing it until it's gone, and then it's a dramatically different experience, and by the way, it's a good one. And when I've talked to these very adept meditators who say they feel emptiness on a regular basis, this is their report. They say, things look a little different, like that fan there is a little less sharply distinguished from its background. They still know it's a fan. They can still turn it on and off. But it's got a little less kind of fan vibe about it or something. But the other thing they say is it's a beautiful thing. The world seems more beautiful to them when this essence is absent. Now, so those are my two semi-profound retreat experiences, one having to do with not self, one having to do with emptiness. I just want to say, finally, I know I keep promising to wrap this up. This really is it. I just want to mention some of the real-world applications of these ideas. Because, after all, it's not, I think most of us would agree, it's not the gravest moral crime to uproot a weed. But this business of imposing essences on things also infuses the way we deal with other human beings. I mean, you've probably heard the term essentialism, right? As a bad thing if you're attributing certain features to a given ethnic group or a given religious group or whatever. That's called essentialism, and I think is rightly denounced. But I think what this tells us is that is these things, essence of, or essence of enemy, essence of rival, these things are more subtly interwoven into the way we deal with the world than we really appreciate. And, lately you've heard probably a lot about political polarization in America. You're hearing more and more about the psychology of tribalism, not just as it afflicts America, but as it afflicts, sectarian conflict, international conflict, and so on. And I think people are more and more realizing that this psychology of tribalism often involves what are called cognitive biases, like, for example, just confirmation bias you may have heard of, which is when you notice and embrace evidence that supports your pre-existing position. You don't notice or find grounds for dismissing evidence that seems to work at odds with your pre-existing position. That's known as confirmation bias. There's another bias called attribution error, whose importance I think is underrated, and it really gets at this idea of essence, and is a good illustration of how seeing, feeling essence in people can influence the way we deal with them. Okay, so here's this cognitive bias. It's called, as I said, attribution error, and here's the way it works. Originally, it was called the fundamental attribution error, and here's the way they thought it worked. It turns out to be a little more complicated, but the original idea was we tend to attribute, in explaining people's behavior, we attribute too much to their disposition and not enough to their situation or circumstance. Okay, so a classic example is you're behind somebody in a checkout line, they're rude to the clerk, and you go, oh, he's a jerk. That's just the kind, right? That's the natural judgment to make. He's a jerk. Now, for all you know, he just had a horrible day and he found out that he has a horrible illness or his spouse does or something. We've all been rude sometimes, right? And for all you know, this was one of his rare rude days. But the tendency is, rather than assume that it could just be circumstance leading to the behavior, to assume that it's disposition, it's his character. Now, it turns out that it's actually more complicated than that, okay? How exactly attribution error works depends on whether it's an ally of yours, a friend, somebody in your tribe, or an enemy, a rival, somebody in the other tribe. If it's an ally, then the good things they do you attribute to their character, to their disposition, okay? And this also applies to you, by the way, right? The good things we do that's the way we are. When I do something good, that's just the kind of guy I am. When I do something bad, it's because it was peer group pressure, I was under stress, I didn't get my nap, whatever. You know, that's the way we are, and we treat our allies, that's the way we assess the behavior of allies. With our enemies and rivals, it's the opposite. If they do something bad, that's the real them. That's their disposition at work. That's their character. If they do something good, it's, oh, they were just trying to impress them, you know, or trying to impress us, or it's a trick or whatever. And you know, when you just think about your past, you know, if you had a rival like at work or a rival for a mate, I mean, if somebody walks up and reports something wonderful this bitter rival did, there's no way you're going to go, yeah, he's a good guy. You know, no, you're going to think, no, that's not the real him, right? And this is deeply built into us, and I think it helps get us into wars. It's one reason I think that when people are agitating for a war, they want us to invade some country, they go to great lengths to demonize the leader. And of course, some of these leaders are not saints, don't get me wrong. But the people who want to go to war always want to make them seem as satanic as possible and it's because of, you know, the reason this works for them as a kind of a propaganda tool is because of this attribution error thing. Once you've got them in that box of enemy, then they can't get out, because anything good they do, it's like, you know, when Saddam Hussein says, okay, let the UN inspectors in. No, I'm sorry, that was too late. We had already decided he was a bad guy. That didn't help. That didn't, you know, and so you can see why, you know, we're going to explain that away as like a trick or just something he's doing to temporarily please us or whatever. You know, I think all of these, you know, if you look at the various cognitive biases that give rise to the kind of the polarization, the tribalism, whatever you want to call it, in our country and beyond the borders of our country, I think the problem consists of these cognitive biases, and I think more than people realize, mindfulness meditation could play a really constructive role in lessening the power of these insidious forces, because I do think it's the same with confirmation bias, by the way, this business of latching on to evidence that you like. If you look at the way, and I think we've all probably contributed to this problem, right? I mean, I know that on Twitter, if I see something that supports my view, I want to retweet it, right? But if you examine what's going on, it is a feeling. You are liking that information that supports your view. And that's what's leading to the impulse to retweet it. And again, mindfulness meditation gives you a little reflective distance, gives you the option of deciding whether these feelings should be trusted as guides or not. So it is my view, I'm a little evangelical about this now, it is my view that mindfulness meditation could play a big role in solving just some of the deepest problems afflicting the world. And if the Buddhist claim is right, and in the process, mindfulness meditation is also helping you see the world more clearly and making you happier, then so much the better. So thank you. And
so we will start our question and answer section. Please, this is Angel. Please wait for him to give you the microphone, and then you can start your question.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
I want to bring up the issue of attachments, right? Because the Buddhism definitely has a lot to say about how attachment leads to suffering. But I happen to teach high school, and I run a course. It's called the Zen Art of Happiness. And, you know, and the head of school asked me, he said, Ken, I mean, you're talking to young people, right? And you talk about not having attachments. I mean, and you know, and the possibility that desire is potentially leading to suffering. So how would you address young people in regard to those teachings? And then also recently I run a Buddhist group on Facebook, and I have a woman who asked me about, isn't attachment part of what makes a family strong? I mean, how do you address pair bonding in that term?
Yeah, so there's kind of a couple of issues there. One is, how far are you going to get by telling teenagers not to have fun, kind of? Is that, yeah. I don't recommend that tack, no. But but teenagers do have problems. And, if you I guess, if you focus on the problems, teenagers, I think more, we're living in an age where there's more and more attention to the issue of addiction to technologies. And I think more and more people, teenagers recognize that, you talk to them about their relationship to Facebook or Instagram or whatever, and you get some of the ambivalence about it. It's like, I couldn't stop, I had to check, and then I checked, and nobody had liked my post, and then I was depressed. So, I think, first of all, I think there are a lot of teenagers who recognize that they, in one sense, have a problem that has to do with attachment in some sense. And so you could start there, I guess. The other thing I'd say is, one form that your question sometimes assumes is, well, if I go down the Buddhist path, will I get to a point where I just don't care about anything? I'm not unhappy, but I no longer pursue any pleasures. I no longer love anyone. I no longer... and it's a good question because, after all, the idea is, in some sense, to allow you to preserve equilibrium and well-being regardless of circumstances. So it's natural to say, well, doesn't that lead to a kind of indifference? And people also ask this about social activism. Will I no longer care about... and so I think, first of all, it's worth emphasizing that virtually no one gets to the point where that's realistically a problem. It's like, if they're worried about getting to a point where they just have no desires and there's nothing they enjoy doing, they will be, they should start a cult or something, because there aren't many people who have gotten to that point. And so too with social activism. I do think it's possible to become so good at maintaining your well-being regardless of conditions that you no longer want to kind of get out there and improve the world. But I just don't know many people who have gotten that far, and for me, it is still enough of a challenge to just want to try to improve the world skillfully. Now, go ahead, you want to follow that?
Yeah. My observation is, in terms of social justice, and the fight for social equality and justice, I see that there's a very strong movement in the Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. But I came from the Chinese Buddhist tradition. There's relatively almost nothing, in terms of social activism. And I'm just wondering, whether, how much does it have to do with the fact that the Buddhists practice, this kind of detachment?
That question has been raised. At the same time, I think you were at the Union Theological Seminary Conference, Bhante Bodhi, in New York not that long ago. And there is a movement among Buddhists in America for social justice. My own hobby horse is foreign policy and fighting against militarism and mindless intervention. And honestly, I don't see that much of that in Buddhism, then again, I don't see that much of that anywhere in America. But as far as social justice goes, there are people, I mean, if you know students who are worried about that, there are definitely people you can put them in touch with. And I know at Union Theological Seminary in New York, Greg Snyder, who's there on the faculty, he has a weekly meeting about this with students like that. And and my own view is just that, I mean, I should also say, I think it is also reported about meditation that it can give you more compassion for people you didn't used to have it for, and I think that's true. And it's not only a product of forms of meditation that are devoted to that, like loving kindness meditation. I personally think just plain old mindfulness meditation that gives you a little more mental equilibrium, because it relaxes the self-centered judgments that otherwise infuse your perceptions of people, allows you to see suffering where you didn't, and allows you to care about it where you didn't. So, I think there's that to be said for meditation. And the number of people who get so far down the path that they just sit in a hut and meditate and don't try to do anything in the world, it's just minuscule. It's just not. And even those people, I think, have something to bring. I mean, some of them may be having very profound realizations that they can tell people about, and that's worth it. But I just don't think. It's true that in the Catholic tradition there is a strong social activism tradition. On the other hand, a large majority of Catholics in America are not involved in it, and that's true of other religions. So I just don't. I don't think that's a particularly Buddhist problem. I'm just trying to think what else I might say to the teenagers, but maybe if there are other questions, I can turn to those and then get back to you on that if I...
Hello, and thank you so much for being here. It's really a thrill. My question, maybe you can help me form the question. I have like two parallel themes. One is, in your book, when you're writing about the modules, that the mind is being sort of pushed around in these different modules. So
Right.
while you're meditating, your comments about this connection that those modules are being propelled by emotions, by feelings, seemed revolutionary. It seemed shocking to me, both to inspire my concentration and my practice. It also seems kind of new in the field of psychology. Is that right? So that's one theme.
Okay.
And then the other theme is, over the last 20, 30 years, a lot of people like you, evolutionary psychologists, scientists, neuroscientists, have been meditating and doing research and are now really writing and influencing psychology. So the question is sort of about, could you comment, is there like a bridge between this idea of amplifying the role of emotions in the field of psychology? Is there some kind of bridge there that you could speak to? Is this even a coherent question? Do you know what I mean? I'm not even like really sure what the question is. But like, is there a meditationally a Buddhist-inspired revolution that's affecting the field of psychology? Is that what my question is? Thank you for helping me.
So your question is whether that's your question.
Yeah, and is it a question? And it is
Um,
something that you have something to say about?
Yeah. So first of all, on the modules, what she's talking about is there's a model of the human mind mainly associated with evolutionary society, according to which the mind, I should say that, to get back to this not self idea in its various dimensions, part of the idea is that this feeling we have that there's this kind of CEO, the conscious me is the CEO that's like running my brain, and I'm doing everything deliberately, and I'm the one making the decisions. There's actually several decades of growing evidence that that's just wrong. That our sense of conscious control over our thought and our actions is exaggerated, if not illusory. Now, one model of the mind that is consistent with this growing realization that the mind isn't just this CEO, this kind of top-down corporate organized thing, is this modular model of the mind. And the idea is that you should think of the mind as these different actors with different agendas, okay? So, like, you may have had the feeling at a cocktail party where, like, you're talking to someone and you're trying to focus on what they're saying, but you can, like, see the desserts, like, just beyond them, the tray of desserts. So, in this view, that would be, like, actually two different modules. There's a module that's involved with talking to people and staying in their good graces, you know, maintaining their esteem, and so you want to be polite, you want to be respectful. But then there's this, like, you know, calorie attainment module, you know, that was in charge of keeping us nourished. And so this is an actual conflict of modules in this model. And there are a bunch of little modules that do different things, including fine-grained modules, according to this model, which is not universally accepted in psychology, but I think it's taken more and more seriously. And in the book, I argue that if you talk to people, like I talked to, in this case, I was talking to Joseph Goldstein, one of the co-founders of the Insight Meditation Society, about how how thoughts can appear to him in meditation, and how that's related to the not-self concept. I argued that his reports are very consistent with a modular model of the mind. The idea that one thing you hear on meditation retreats, especially from teachers, sometimes is thoughts think themselves. You think that you're thinking them, but actually they're just kind of being injected into consciousness, and then you take ownership of them as if the conscious you thought them, but actually they're just kind of floating by. Well, that's the modular model. That's what it says. There are these different players. They compete for access to your consciousness, and the one that wins gets to inject its thought. Its thought. It may be the module that's in charge of vengeance. So the thought is about what you're going to do to this horrible person, or it may be a different module. But the winning module is what is dominating your consciousness, and I speculated that maybe what determines the winning module is which one has the strongest feeling associated with it. In which case, it would make sense that, and this is a segue to the second part of your question, I think. I mean, I think one product of the kind of introspection that mindfulness meditation can afford you is to see that more than you might have realized, thoughts often have like feeling associated with them. There's not that many, when you really pay attention, there's not that many, and even perceptions. It gets back to the weed thing, right? Perceptions have feelings associated with them. Those feelings are what inform the sense of essence. But thoughts are the same way. I mean, thoughts enter your mind, and if you pay close attention, they're usually either welcome or not welcome. Right? They're a thought that like agitates you, and you want to do something to resolve the agitation, or it's like, yeah, I like that. So this modular model could explain why like thoughts feel like they're injected into consciousness when you really start paying attention, and why they tend to have feelings associated with them. And as for this second question of yours about Buddhism and psychology, well, one kind of connection is that psychology has only very slowly come to an insight that I think is found in Buddhist psychology going way back, which is just that this idea of thinking of there being cognition on the one hand and feeling on the other. You know, there's like the limbic system, which does feeling, and then there's the frontal part that does thought. That dichotomy is just false. It's just misleading because, in fact, feeling and thought and feeling and perception are really finely intertwined. And I think psychology is happening upon that, and neurology is assisting in this. And I think in that sense, psychology is becoming more Buddhist. Now, that may not be exactly what you're asking.
From your perspective, do you feel that psychology is grabbing this and taking it and able to expand, or like, is it struggling to get hold of?
Oh, well, I think, you know, I think there are a number of people in this field in psychology who are saying things like this who have no idea that it's even in Buddhist psychology or philosophy, which is fine. I mean, that's independent corroboration, right? If science separately reaches this conclusion that Buddhism reached a long time ago, that's fine with me. I think what I'd like to see happen in psychology is, there have been a lot of studies on like mindfulness meditation, anxiety reduction, well-being, and so on. I'd like to see studies where they see if these cognitive biases I'm talking about can be diminished through, really kind of concerted mindfulness meditation. That would be an important new finding.
Thank you so much.
Do people mind if I take a picture of the audience? It's my wife sometimes doubts my importance. This really will pretty much close the case for all. Okay, thank you. What's that?
Could have been yesterday's audience.
What do you mean? What? Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for coming, and I really learned a lot. As we were talking about during lunch, you said your book is translated into Chinese. It's in the process of being translated into Chinese.
Right.
So my question is, what is the essential message you wanted to convey and the purpose, the sole purpose you wanted to serve through this book to audience or reader? Because if I am a friend of a friend and then I want to recommend this book to my friend, I'm going to tell him or her, you have to read the book because.
Okay.
Also, there's in Zen, there's a story that says the finger pointing to the moon, and the essence actually is the moon, not the finger that's pointing at it. Would you consider your book as this finger? Thank you.
Well, it's not the moon. Yeah, it is being translated in Chinese, both in Taiwan and on the mainland. And in fact, I've been really gratified by it's in Asia. It's also being translated into Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Thai, and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka. And this is more than I've ever had. I mean, so it's a total of like 18 languages or something. I've never seen that before. And I have to say, the title, the title has its downsides. You have to spend a certain amount of time defensively explaining what you mean by it. But I suspect that in some Buddhist countries it was an asset. It probably got their attention, and maybe that's why it's being translated. So my advice to authors is to title books, whatever, pick a religion and then is true, and you'll get it translated in however many countries there are who subscribe to that. It kind of depends on who you're talking. As far as I think depends on who you're talking to in terms of. But I think I've always thought that if you put the Buddhist message in that really crisp form, the reason you suffer is because you don't see the world clearly. And it's also the reason you do things to other people that you later regret. If you say to people, look, you can do 3 things at once. You can see the world more clearly, you can be happier, and you can be a better person. I think that's a pretty strong sales pitch. It's not mine, but it's what Buddhism says. In terms of, and I should say, you don't have to attain full enlightenment to realize some of that promise, right? It's like if through mindfulness meditation, if you're meditating every morning, and so you have this, you're at the checkout counter, the person in front of you is rude, and because you've meditated that day, you don't so quickly jump to that conclusion of like, this guy's a jerk, and I've got to get on to my next appointment, and this is like a total pain, and it's ruining my day, then, that has made your life a little easier, but also just by not perceiving that essence of jerk in the person, that's a truer view of things, because you don't know why that person was rude. So you're actually clarifying your view. So I like to describe enlightenment as just a process not like a state. Some people may attain the state, and that would be great. But it's a process that you can make incremental progress along. And so I would certainly emphasize those practical benefits to people. Now, in terms of what is actually distinctive about the book, I find that some people find the evolutionary psychology helpful because, if you do mindfulness meditation and listen to meditation teachers and go on retreat, you'll see pretty quickly that one subtext of their instruction is, don't take your feelings too seriously. They don't put it quite that way, but that's clearly a take-home message, is that by nature we do take our feelings seriously. We accept their guidance, we do what they tell us to do, and one of the messages is, just don't take them so seriously. And I think explaining, it's like the third chapter or something that's called something about our feelings, when our feelings illusions, or something like that. When does it make, which gives you the whole background on like, why do feelings exist in the first place from an evolutionary standpoint? Why do the specific feelings that are part of human nature exist? What were they designed to do? Was that a good thing in the first place? I mean, should we even pay attention to natural selection? And isn't it even more absurd when we're in a modern environment and these things aren't even doing us any good, like road rage? I find that for a lot of people, understanding the evolutionary backstory, like where does rage come from and where does anxiety come from, they find that it helps inform their practice. So that's kind of distinctive to the book, that particular emphasis. And then there's my evangelical sermon about human conflict and tribalism. There is some of that in the book. I doubt it's the strongest selling point for people, but it's a reason that it's one reason I want people to read the book.
So one of the things I found most helpful in your book was your actual real-time examples where you perceive something as, okay, this is an incremental step in the right direction. So working off of one of your examples, a place where I am at now, which is behind you, so maybe you can help guide me, is when are you observing and when have you fallen over into thinking and to it? You're sitting at your computer, you have an urge you have an urge to shop for smartphones, I believe it was, and somehow very quickly you diagnose it as, I don't want to deal with a structural problem. Somehow you already know the answer.
Right.
But suppose you get mindful about that urge and you say it's a structural problem, and then you say, well, actually my daughter's out hiking in the Arizona desert. Actually, wait, is she in the Arizona desert? Should I be worried about where she is? And suddenly, your mind is moving in a different direction. I'm wondering, at what point do you feel I'm no longer observing, I'm thinking? Mm-hmm. At what point is this no longer mindful? This is one of my modules? I mean, I'm just wondering how far you take the probing before you decide this is not a meditative state anymore.
First of all, let me say, just by way of background, the part of my book she's talking about is where I talk about how I have attention problems. I mean, technically I have attention deficit disorder. They didn't call it that when I was a kid, but it's like not being able to pay attention is what we called it when I was a kid. And I just note that if you pay attention to yourself when you are distracted, like I'm trying to write something, if you pay attention to distraction, it is feeling driven. It is like I'm trying to write something, I run into a little bit of an obstacle, a structural problem with the writing, as she was saying, and that feels bad. It makes me like not want to look at that piece of writing. And then the thought enters my mind, you could be like researching smartphones. You need to buy a smartphone, and that feels good. And so a bad feeling pushes me away from what I'm supposed to be doing. A good feeling draws me toward what I'm not supposed to be doing. So that's the example she was talking about. Now, first of all, I should say, since you're asking about my experience, I am not a role model because I am not a great meditator, and I never was, and I'm better than I used to be. But you know, it fluctuates, and right now I feel like I really need a retreat. I haven't been to a retreat in about 1.5 years, and I find I need that as a kind of a recharge. So I think my daily practice at the moment is not as powerful as it has been sometimes, you know, and as a result, I'm succumbing more often to the temptation to like surf the web rather than work than I might otherwise, although not as often as I would if I weren't meditating at all. Now, so you're asking about kind of that, like, how do you know when you're lost in thought? I mean, of course, when you're lost in it, you don't know, right? I mean, it's like, there's this thing I mentioned in my book where my first retreat, you know, you would have, like twice a week, we met with a teacher. The silence would be broken for 45 minutes while like 7 or 8 of us could meet with a teacher. And I'd say like, yeah, I just can't focus on my breath. And she said, so you notice that you're not focusing on your breath? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, that's good. And I said, wait, it's good that I'm not focusing on my breath? She said, no, it's good that you're noticing that you're not focusing on my breath. And I'm like, but it happens like all the time. And she says, well, that's even better because you're noticing a lot. And it's, you know, when you're, I mean, it's hard because not all thought is, I'm not like against thought. You know, there is such a thing as constructive thought. I mean, is that part of the question? Like, how do you tell the constructive thoughts from the unconstructive thoughts?
I guess because there are those who coach not thought, welcome not thought, you know, stick with the breath. But
Yeah.
you say in your book, that's only part of the way, and I happen to be inclined to agree with you. You want to take it to a place where you're understanding. But as soon as you're going to try to understand, you're going to be thinking.
Right.
So it seems contradictory.
Yeah, well, understanding is, in that sense, in one sense, discouraged. My tendency was always to think like, oh, I'm thinking, you know, and wait, what was I thinking about before this? What was the series of thoughts that led me to this? You're not supposed to do that. Don't do that if you're meditating. They discourage that. You know, it's a challenge. I will also say that I personally have had more trouble getting, in a sense, distance, quote, from thoughts than from feelings. I find it easier to observe feelings than thoughts. And I actually think the reason for that is, it gets back to the thing I said about modules and feelings. I think because feelings are kind of the things that usher thoughts in and cement them to your consciousness when they're sticking, that I think a logical progression is to get good at observing your feelings, become very aware of your feelings, and that makes it easier to become aware of your thoughts because you become more aware of the subtle thoughts that are associated with the feelings. So I don't, maybe all I've done is confirm what I originally said, which is I'm not a good role model, but I'm not a credentialed meditation teacher, but you know, I would say it's hard, you know, it's hard to convince yourself to get on the cushion every morning or whenever you do it. In my experience, it's worth it. And I'm also a big advocate of retreats, even though they don't go well for everyone. But everyone I personally recommend to go to one has been a satisfied customer. There's about 10 or 12 people in that category. Now, I don't know how long I should. Is there an authority figure in the room who wants to tell me how long to?
Maybe the last 2 questions.
Okay, fine. I mean, I can go as long as I get to sit down every once in a while. I can go all night.
So
I'll
Angel,
sit
you want
down
to-
during the questions. And
I just wanted to ask one question real quick. So yesterday, me and Katie, we saw a snake come across, and it made me think about this symbol. I don't know if a lot of people know it, where the snake is eating itself and stuff like that. And what was that? The Ouroboros. Okay, that one. And it made me think about your analogy when it came to this donut, right? So it made me think about that aspect and perspective when it comes to this notion of, you know, based on perspective, sometimes you're eating the donut, sometimes you are the donut. And one thing that I was just trying to understand with anxiety was this notion of control and categorization. And, you know, my question to you is this aspect: does it all come down to I guess the main problem of simultaneously accepting that we are living and dying like nonstop? So we are simultaneously the predator as well as the prey, the person eating the donut as well as the donut itself. Is that what it all comes down to? So that's my question.
So can you flesh that out a little? Actually, well, yeah. I mean, are there examples of like when this would occur to you?
Yeah, like whenever, I guess, when it comes to anxiety, I've noticed that I'm trying to categorize and control things and,
Okay.
and compartmentalize things.
Right.
When I tend to accept that I have no control over the situation, but I am both, rather than looking at things
Oh, I
as
see.
black or white, but rather black and white, it has allowed me to be that snake that or the donut as well, that
Yeah.
it's circular. So simultaneously, what I keep coming to is that I need to accept my present state, that although I'm living today, I'm also dying today. So and that's what my question is to you. Do you believe that that's our ultimate, question of, are we that donut as well as the one that's devouring it?
Okay. I mean, one thing you said. I mean, at least one way of looking at one thing you said is gets at something very deeply Buddhist, which is to recognize that you are not just an actor; you are acted upon, right? I mean, our natural tendency is to see the environment as like this passive thing that we're operating on, and we're going to go make things happen, and certainly a big Buddhist emphasis is on how pervasively whatever you do is a product of influences that have impinged on you, right? And this is, I think there are a number of things about Buddhism that I think are a little more, is this one of them? Western than is appreciated. I mean, I would just say that there are certainly Western philosophers who have called into question this idea of cause and effect in the sense of a binary thing. Like, this is the agent, and this is the consequence. I mean, I think Buddhism has a much subtler view. Or another way of looking at it is Buddhism sees causality as just this it has a pervasive appreciation of causality. It's like everything is causality. Everything is, influences are always operating. And that has a number of take-home lessons, when in looking at your own behavior and other people's behavior. It can help make you more compassionate toward people when you realize that when they do bad things, it's the result of influences that impinged on them. It can make you more forgiving of yourself when that's in order. Now, there probably is such a thing as people who are too forgiving when it comes to them, but that's I think these days especially not the main problem. With anxiety, I guess you're saying it's like it's an illusion that you're in control in the first place. I mean, you're going to be reacting to things whether you know it or not. You're not just the agent, and I think that's by my understanding, that is a Buddhist way to look at it. It can be a useful way to look at it. There's a more oblique way in which understanding the mystifyingly pervasive nature of causality can help with anxiety, which is just like in terms of, if you just follow in your life history, like what has led to what, to the extent that you can even discern that, right? Like, if I hadn't gotten this job, this wouldn't have happened. If I hadn't, you will quickly realize that you really have no idea whether the thing you are hoping will happen tomorrow will in the long run lead to, to good things. It's just, it seems just as often the case that something superficially bad, some piece of superficially bad fortune, ultimately led to something good than the opposite. So I think, I mean, I think, you know, two things. Appreciating, yes, that you are, you're not, you know, not seeing yourself as this highly potent agent, but as this thing that is existing in flux, as are all these other things, can have a number of good consequences, including reducing anxiety. And I think so, you know, you can also get something out of this idea that just the way things unfold is completely unpredictable. So fixating on a certain outcome, you know, it's just, it's fine to have goals. I mean, you can make reasonable guesses about what might be good and what might not, and you should pursue your interests and so on. But I do think a more sophisticated understanding of causality and the way it unfolds can help in a lot of ways, and I think that's just very deeply Buddhist. It is more than many Western philosophers realize. A big part of Buddhism is emphasizing the pervasiveness of influence, and seeing it as so pervasive that it's almost always misleading to chop things up and say this was the agent and this was the object.
Thank you, Robert. Regarding the Buddha's teachings, from what I have understood, in addition to the mind, it also covers not to hurt other people.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that
not
part.
to harm other people.
Oh, yeah.
And to do good with loving kindness, compassion, and also improve your mind and practice meditation. Whatever. Buddha, as most of us know, was one of the pioneers of loving kindness and also of social justice. Because Buddha has said that a person should be recognized not by his birth, but for his actions. So which means technically we are all one. It also goes...
Now, so can you say that last part again, make sure I understand?
We are all sort of equal.
Okay.
We are not, yeah. So there should be any discrimination in any form. But in addition to that, the concept of loving kindness should be extended to all sentient beings, not only to mankind, but even to other animals.
Right.
So he's one of the pioneers of this thought in the whole world, because he's been there preaching this over 2,600 years ago. And thank you very much for what you are connecting with the correcting the meditation and the mind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, well, sure. Well, certainly, yeah. Non-harm to sentient beings and a concern for the well-being of all sentient beings is clearly an important principle in Buddhism. And it's, you mentioned loving kindness, and there is a whole meditation called loving kindness meditation. I have to admit, I haven't had great success with it. I think that maybe the way it works, but a lot of people do. I encourage you to try it. The way it works is you generally start out trying to extend loving kindness. Typically, it begins with yourself, I think, and I think that's where I have the problem. but then it gets to slightly harder cases like relatives and friends, and then at the very end you get to like these enemies, and you're supposed to make an effort to extend loving kindness to them, and I think a lot of people get a lot out of it. But I also think that it can happen that regular, like mindfulness meditation can steer you in that same direction. I mean, I know I've had at a retreat once as just kind of an experiment, and I hadn't been doing loving kindness meditation particularly, it was just mindfulness meditation. I thought about probably my most bitter enemy in the world. He's like a professional person. He's actually got caught up in the Me Too scandal, read about him in the newspapers. And I was actually kind of proud at how little joy I got out of that. I think before I started meditating, I would have gotten more joy. But anyway, the point is, on this meditation retreat, this is long before this is years and years ago, I started thinking about him, and I hadn't been doing mindfulness or loving kindness meditation, but I just suddenly had this ability. I imagined what his adolescence had been like. He's like not one of these guys who would have been like the tough guy in the playground. He wouldn't have been like really athletic. He wouldn't have been succeeding in the conventional ways on the playground in junior high. And, you know, I just am aware of how formative that can be, and how not succeeding in the conventional ways can make you double down on areas where you do have success and maybe become insufferably arrogant about how smart you are or whatever it is. And I just had this totally different view of him that allowed me to actually have positive feelings about him, which hadn't happened in years. And I just say that because, you know, I do think, I mean, you know, it's like, well, it gets back to the fact that I think I was seeing the world more clearly, and I think I was also I was approaching both truth and moral truth more closely. I was actually having a truer, you know, because my normal way of my normal way of feeling about him, because he was an enemy, it just would not have allowed me to do that little thought experiment where I thought about his adolescence in a sympathetic way. You just don't do that with enemies, right? You do it with friends. You do it with your offspring. I mean, you know, with offspring, it's very easy to understand how their insecurities and frustrations lead them to misbehave. But it's very hard to do with enemies. And so, you know, I think that's an example of having a literally clearer view of the world. I suspect that little hypothesis I had about his adolescence was correct. And at the same time, getting closer to moral truth, the moral truth being that, in my view, we're all victims, including him, and, you know, we should, of course, try to intervene to prevent bad behavior, and people may have to be punished for that reason, but it's never good in and of itself to punish someone, because I think we are all victims. Retribution, I think, is never a good in and of itself, even if punishment is necessary as a skillful intervention. So I think in viewing him that way, I think I was closer to the moral truth. I was closer to just the actual truth about things. And I think I was happier and more at peace than I am when I'm thinking about an enemy and thinking, what a jerk. That's actually not that pleasant a feel. I mean, it has its pleasant aspects. That must be the reason we keep doing it, right? But it's not, you know, if you compare it to the opposite of being more at peace in your perceptions with others, it's not as conducive to your own well-being. So that's my take on loving kindness and being good to other sentient beings. So I don't know.
I think there's one more person.
One more.
Someone just raising the hand.
Did anybody else
earlier.
have one?
Yeah. Okay. So this will be the last question. Okay.
That puts a lot of pressure on me now to
Yeah, this is an important.
tie everything up, and it's probably going to end up being very trivial because it's been about 10 years since I read your book, The Evolution of God, which I found very engaging and very educational. And here, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but what I recall was one of your major hypotheses in the book was that globally mankind is moving towards a sort of a unified monotheism. And I was just wondering now, over the last decade, and especially with your new book, if now you feel that maybe humankind is moving towards some sort of a Buddhist mindset.
Well, Well, I would say I wouldn't. I don't think I was like predicting that humankind was heading toward a global monotheism. I can see where you got that because I do trace. I mean, the book is about the Abrahamic religions. It's about the Abrahamic God. It's about how that conception of God took shape, and I follow it through not only kind of the birth of Judaism, but of Christianity and of Islam. And so I do trace. I mean, I do argue that I think in some ways it was a kind of a natural drift, within those traditions, and it was a way to reconcile or come closer to reconciling a conception of divinity with science. I mean, just in the sense that, once you have a scientific understanding of what creates thunder, it doesn't make as much sense to see Zeus is hurling down thunderbolts or whichever god was supposed to do that. I think it was Zeus. So there is all that in the book, but I'm not projecting monotheism as the future of humankind. The other theme I try to trace in that book is to look at what brings out the best in religions and what circumstances are conducive to people in one religion getting along with people in another religion. Because I'm very anti-scriptural determinism. It's like I think if your response to 9/11 was to go read the Quran to figure out what had happened, I think that's not really the place to look. That's just my view about the relationship between scripture and actual behavior, is that all of these Abrahamic religions have scriptures that justify belligerence. They all have scriptures that justify tolerance. And the question is, what circumstances bring out the good part of religion? And there I was arguing that as the world becomes more intertwined, and this gets back to the book that Bhante Bodhi had read in 2001, came out in 2000, that book chronicled the growing intertwinement of humankind, the growing interconnection, interdependence of humankind, and argued that more and more we're going to need bodies of global governance and so on, because there are more and more problems we have to solve cooperatively. They are technically non-zero-sum problems. That's where the title of the book comes from. And basically the argument about religions is when two religions see themselves as being in a non-zero-sum relationship, that is to say, they see that they can benefit through cooperation, well, then they both find grounds for cooperation in their scriptures. If you look, basically, in fact, I think you'll just find that if you say you're a business person and you run into someone that you think you can do business with, oh, you're in this line, well, maybe we can do business. Then whatever they tell you about their religion, you're going to want to feel favorably inclined toward it. I mean, once you have the sense that you can collaborate productively with people, profitably with people to your mutual benefit, you're just not looking for things to dislike about them. And if you're religious, you're looking for things in your religious tradition that would justify positive interaction with them. So the hope I do have about the future of religion is that if people accurately perceive that we are in non-zero-sum relationships more and more, that our fates are intertwined. It is, environmental problems, all kinds of problems, not just environmental problems, but all kinds of problems that we can only solve collectively, like, controlling spooky biological weapons, controlling global pandemics, all kinds of things we can only do together. My hope is that if religions perceive themselves to be in non-zero-sum relationship with other religions, then the better side of religions will increasingly come out. I certainly, at a minimum, think that we need to be, in conducting our own foreign policy, we need to be mindful of the fact that when people feel threatened by you, it just brings out the worst. It just brings out the worst in their religion, in their character. It's like if you want people to focus on the belligerent parts of the Quran, just do what we've been doing in many cases. So that's a big take-home of that book. You know, I think the forms that religion will assume and spirituality will assume are in many ways undetermined. But, you know, one thing I like about Buddhism is that it has this, you know, it does, again, it has these parts that you could say are more religious in the traditional sense, and some parts you could call supernatural, but it has this core of philosophy and psychology and diagnosis and prescription that I think, even if you know, don't buy any of the religious supernatural part, I think it still qualifies as spiritual, because it's just talking about a fundamental breakthrough of perception, ultimately. I mean, and a transformation of consciousness that actually, in theory, aligns your consciousness with the truth about the world, the metaphysical truth about the world, and with moral truth. And I just think that's and it also is a struggle. It's a strenuous endeavor to begin to appreciate that in a really deep way. And in my mind, that qualifies as a spiritual endeavor. You know, I guess that's a good note to end on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so just want to make sure that you know there's refreshment over there in that book sale room, so please, you can enjoy. And we are going to have a group photo for your wife. So anyone want to join the group photo, please come forward, and after that you can have your book signed by Bob. And if you have more time, can you stay a little while, because we need some volunteers to help move up the tables and the chairs. Thank you so much. All right. And by the way, I want to tell you, since we are talking about Buddhism and meditation today, we have an upcoming 6-week introduction of Buddhism classes. This classes was we conduct this class first time this year, and this is designed for younger generations, for like college students or high school students. They are interested in, no, not for adults. Okay, yeah, but the program will be 6 weeks. We will give out certificate after the program, and if you are committed to 6 weeks and you come for the whole section, we will give out certificate afterwards. And the program will be conducted by our resident monks. So it will be a very good program. All right. And also we